Hey everybody, Jonathan Broadbent here. Welcome to another episode of UnWoke Academy. I'm your host, Jonathan Broadbent. I want to talk a little bit about pretty conveyor belts. My concept for today is conveyor belt of bad ideas. So let's let's pause for a moment and think about what life was probably like for our parents and grandparents in the United States back when there was pretty universal freedom, liberty, small business, and burgeoning economies. So back in that era, your local towns and communities would have been full of all sorts of things, different drugstores and department stores, different restaurants. You could go to an accountant or an investment firm or a doctor, and they were typically local. They were not centralized, they were not federalized, and they certainly weren't globalized. And there was competition. In that environment, there were all kinds of different things that we might choose from. And sometimes they would have all sorts of posh veneer to them, and they might look like a beautiful dentist's office, for instance. But you might also find that you're a dentist or an optometrist or an accountant didn't have a whole lot of pomp and circumstance. They didn't have a glorious looking office. Well, we've gone into a trend, and I think we can all acknowledge it now, where everything has become sort of homogenous and lumped together and federalized and then globalized. And then now it's managed by a few of these big trillionaire globalist sorts of firms that manage big money. We've talked many times about DIS the left. That stands for know where you donate, invest, and spend. But I want to drill down a little bit into what some of the options are for business development, what business should look like, could look like, and might one day look like again in America. We've gone from and I'm going to use a few analogies based on my experiences. When I was growing up, there was a local doctor. I don't think he was affiliated with anybody. He just had sort of this local office, and I would go in. It was sort of okay looking. It didn't look like glamorous or anything, but it just had a little waiting room, and I would wait and go in. And he would take his time, and he was very caring. He was actually referred by a family friend of mine, and I stuck with him for years. I had great experiences in there, but he was the type that would ask a lot of questions about sort of my lifestyle and choices and how much sleep I was getting, and made suggestions about dietary habits. And he was struck me as a very caring individual. I will not say that there are no caring individuals in medicine these days. However, medicine is a key prime example of the antithesis and what we've gotten to now. And that is these businesses that have like this beautiful looking veneer to them. And hospitals, if you've been at any of the hospitals like the ones that I see near me, and there are three major ones not far from where I live, that they appear to be competition, but from what I gather, I think there's a lot of sort of collaboration. And I can't say price fixing because I don't know, but it does appear that there's a lot of sort of shared commonality and very little actual competition, in my judgment, between them and their actions. By the way, as a side note, that is very prevalent in the world of finance. A lot of these big globalist mega financial firms, they own parts of each other. And I think behind the curtain, there are just a small handful of mega billionaire globalists who own big chunks of all of those different financial firms. And so I'm kind of jumping around as I sort of become my habit, but hopefully you can follow me on this because I see some commonalities in how we consume goods and services. So it used to be whatever the thing was you were looking for, if it was a pair of boots or a toothbrush, or go to your local drugstore or something. Back in our grandparents' era, there would be some local provider of that, and they knew that they had to compete for your business. And they were constantly looking to find and deliver you good value and good service. because they knew if they didn't, you could go down the street to their competitor, and there was a true competitor, and that person, company, group, or organization might do a better job, and they would never see you again, and they would lose profit. Well, the more you get into communism, whatever you want to call it, the sort of homogenous grouping together of all business ownership and leadership and structures, the less impetus there is to compete for your business. And we're seeing that across the board. And it used to be really there, my mind floods with examples like restaurants. So it used to be there were lots of restaurants in your community. Recently, we made a big splash and a big buzz around Bud Light, which is the parent company, Anheuser-Busch. They made some bad choices, and people went to, I guess, some other competitor for light beer. But let's think back to what life used to look like many years ago in the States and throughout Europe and most of the rest of the world. There would be some local brewery. If you're a beer drinker, you could pick from some local brewery. And if that local brewery made some bad decision and irked you, they did something to upset you, you could just switch, and maybe you'd buy from one county over or one community away or something, buy their beer. But when you have Bud Light, who is, I guess they probably have a global footprint, or at least North America, probably Mexico, probably Canada, and definitely the United States, or I don't know what their footprint is, but that's just huge. Who knows how many zillions of gallons of stuff that they brew up and just spread around everywhere. So I got into a tangent with that one, but the point is that when we had local business, not only did we experience thriving local economies, we also avoided that top-down hierarchical structure. But let's drill down a little bit further on that and exactly what that looks like relative to the goods and services we consume. So I started to mention hospitals, and there are three big ones. Actually, within 45 minutes of me, there are four really big hospital systems. And I'll tell you what, their buildings are amazing. They're beautiful buildings. They're like works of art with all these the marble and glass and the latest architecture, and they have these rooftop terraces with gardens and these exotic restaurants that you can go to and to eat wonderful foods on the rooftop and all that stuff. And those places look beautiful. The problem is, as we're experiencing, as we're seeing, I suggest that the quality of care has gone down. We have an environment now where there's just sort of this conveyor belt of medical activity. And as we've touched on before, it's turned into actually a destructive environment where we have big pharma influencing those hospital systems. What happens there? The doctors training, the doctors and medical staff continuing education, they influence all that stuff. So you have these big, beautiful buildings, but then people go in and they're constantly talking about how they're coming out feeling like they're not getting healthier. And clearly that's the case. When we look at America, where we are relative to the rest of the world, we spend more and we have beautiful looking facilities, but we're not healthier than anywhere else. Same thing with schools. Schools, K through 12, all across the United States are constantly building these ever newer and more advanced and exciting, beautiful looking buildings with the latest solar array panel structures on the rooftop and the latest and greatest LED lighting technology and the smoothest blacktop and the parking lot and all this stuff and Wi-Fi beamed all throughout and everything. Yet, in case you didn't know this, it's important to know I'm in the state of Ohio. Ohio used to be a top 10 destination for education. It's dropped, I understand, to roughly 38th out of 50 states. At the same time, Ohio, as a state, has dropped its academic standards. So they've softened the standards at the same time that proficiency scores among students in Ohio has dropped drastically. At the same time, the United States has fallen to roughly dead last in academics of all industrialized nations. And at the same time, the United States and Ohio in particular has achieved the awful status of one of the most expensive places on the planet to educate children. I should probably air quote that. Educate, air quoted, children. So we have this environment using those two analogies, those examples of healthcare, medicine, pharmaceutical, all kind of conjoined, and then education and the whole education piece, which is publishing and data mining and technology and all that stuff, and that all the administrators and staff and all those things that wrap into what should be education has fallen to roughly dead last and most expensive on the planet. That is a terrible circumstance to be in. Um, and absolutely, the same thing holds true for the world of finance. And actually, I'm going to back up a step and draw one more illustration to kind of prove that point and drive it home a little bit further. I grew up in a community outside of Cleveland, Ohio called Shaker Heights. If you ever watched the Drew Carey show, if you're not familiar with Drew Carey, he's a comedian. For a period of time, he had a funny TV show on called The Drew Carey Show. And in that show, he used to like to make fun of a community called Shaker Heights. That is where I was born and raised. I grew up in Shaker Heights, graduated from those schools. For a period of time, they were held out as kind of one of the premier public education school systems in the country. They've fallen significantly. My take on that is many decades of voting to the left. They have adopted far left policies and moved further and further to the left. And the further they go, the worse they fall, the lower the home prices. It's falling into disrepair. And I hate to see that. It's really unfortunate. The same thing happened to my mom's alma mater in East Cleveland, a school she went to, a school called Shaw. If you know the Cleveland area, you'll know what that means. That is an area. Um, People make a lot of the race issue because it used to be all white. Now it's primarily black. I don't think it's a race issue at all. I think that it's a politics issue. I think that politics moved East Cleveland, and now Shaker Heights. And then you can add to that list Baltimore, LA, Chicago. Those far left policies have nothing to do with skin pigment or any of those sorts of things. It's an ideology that invades and it destroys cities and communities and education. Sorry, I got into a tangent. The point is that when I was in Shaker Heights, it was held out to be this premier place, and there were lots of beautiful homes there. It was back in the day, it was kind of a blue blood, a lot of old money there, big mansions, the 15 bedroom type with 10 bathrooms and indoor heated tennis court kind of environment. But I discovered through growing up there in and traveling into some of those homes, oftentimes, a lot of the time, I found that there was extreme dysfunction. So you would look at the outside of these palatial mansions and they would look like, oh my gosh, look at the kids have these Mercedes and these exotic cars, and it looks like they have everything all set based on what we see in concepts from movies and television, Hollywood portrayal. That's it. You're supposed to have this big mansion and exotic sports cars and things, and poof, your life is great. But I met a lot of the people who were horribly sad and dysfunctional, a lot of them alcoholic, drug abusers, because they had no joy. They had really just anxiety and stress, and they just had no joy. So kind of conjoining all of those together and thinking about the appearance or facade of something that's presented to you as some sort of ideal, and our consumers' ideas of what a product or service should look like. We have moved away from analyzing the product or service and into sort of the superficial realm. I don't mean it this in an accusatory way. But I do want to hopefully get you thinking in terms of like, how do you consume products and services? We know now, because mostly because of COVID, we know what's going on in our education system. A lot of people woke up, but also because of COVID, we're beginning to question the delivery of healthcare. Is it truly healthcare? Is it beneficial? Or is that big, beautiful ivory tower hospital system a conveyor belt of bad ideas driven by pharmaceutical? So does pharmaceutical make billions of dollars in profit, pump some of that back into the hospital, which then builds these glorious looking buildings only to just cram people in there and shovel them full of a product? In similar fashion, we have that in education. The product right now is not education, it's not academic proficiency, it's DEI, SEL, um, CSI, comprehensive sexuality, CSE, comprehensive sexuality education, social emotional learning, critical race theory in the form of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's all this stuff that's pumped in. The amount of money that's made off of that stuff is unbelievable. We're talking $1.5 billion over the last couple of years. In my state of Ohio, I believe 440 million of that funneled into Ohio, and then tons of people made huge profit. But the product, and I mentioned it moments ago, the byproduct of that, the result is not good. Education is the key that opens all doors. Let me say that again. I got tongue tied. Education is the key that opens all doors. And assuming that is true, and it is, we have a lot of closed doors to young students these days. They're going to get out into the world and realize that they're not going to go far with barely literate uh, and struggling math skills. It's heartbreaking, but that's the product. That's the result of skewing to the left as far as we've gone in education. And look at our health. Our health is horrible. Now let's move to finance. That's my area of expertise, and I've spent decades there. I have had the opportunity to go into and spend time deeply involved and immersed in many different financial firms, big Wall Street type financial firms. I've gone in and met all their key leadership teams and done due diligence, and I've dug in. And the result, I'm just going to sum up as discouraging. There is a great deal of dysfunction and lack of interest, lack of motivation or competition or appetite within the world of finance, and very similar to the pharmaceutical impact on healthcare. We have a monumental and really unhealthy influence in from investment managers, banks, and portfolio managers into the world of finance. So they're feeding money into the system that, again, just like all the new school buildings and all the new hospital buildings, we have all of these big, glorious, beautiful looking financial buildings, and they're full of people. Not that and again, I don't mean to disparage an entire marketplace or industry. There are good people out there, and I know many of them who really care a lot, but they're hamstrung often because they're captive in this environment that is a conveyor belt of bad ideas. The general consensus is it is a sales and marketing entity only. And the higher the profit the thing, the more that's going to be crammed down the throats of consumers. So just like those experiences that I had as a child, where I would go in and meet with that independent doctor, and that doctor would take time to actually ask me questions and try to encourage a healthier life and lifestyle out of me. We now have an environment where a comparable present day medical experience would be going in. I have a massive waiting room crammed with people. And after a while, I go into a room, I get three different people that come through, each for about 2 or 4 minutes a piece. They ask me a series of questions that are designed to lead me to the conclusion that some subscription or prescription rather to something is probably required. And then I leave with a slip of paper. I stop off at one of the big mega globalist pharmaceutical firms, and they shovel out and make profit off of that thing, just like the hospital does. And the doctor, as we found with COVID, doctors are now sometimes incentivized to sell a specific prescription. And that's horrible. We saw it with what are called SSRI. That's coming back to haunt us now. There were incentives, financial incentives for doctors to prescribe and maybe arguably overprescribe SSRI. Now, in the world of finance, we have us, you, me, your company 401k, your IRA, your bank rep, your insurance agent, whatever. The people who work in finance and the people who consume financial products and services are being led into that big ivory tower, beautiful, brand new, luxurious looking financial building. And then once we get in there, we're on the conveyor belt of bad ideas and we're shoveled product. How quickly, and here's another way of looking at that, it becomes a matter of a question of how quickly they can get us in, signed up for something, and then back out again at maximum profit. That's a horrible, horrible structure. And when we as a society agree to put that methodology, that process and a belief system in place in K through 12 education, in healthcare, in our financial lives, we are ruining ourselves. So maybe the answer is going back and thinking more like our parents and grandparents did and start rebuilding at the local level, seed fund, and then encourage the growth of local alternatives to those big globalist firms that are a conveyor belt of bad ideas. I'm Jonathan Broadbent. This has been another episode of UnWoke.Academy. Thanks for listening.